After this very long introduction, it was only to convince you of the importance of the question. We can begin to study what is a change. And I respect my proper law, which is that you must know some points of the history of the question, of the philosophical question of change. We can observe the very beginning of this point that the change, the empirical change of all what exists, the change of the life, the change of the world, the change of the situations and so on, is probably the most important point of our reflexive experience. The meditation concerning change is a constant of all cultures, without exception. Poetry, for example, is largely, in all cultures, a sort of profound action in language to say something concerning our subjective relationship to the universal mobility of things. And this idea that all perish, all move, and so on, it's the background of a great number of creative work of art, poetry, and so on. So there is, we cannot forget this point, there is a sort of universal experience of change and universal meditation concerning change, and concerning also the universal becoming of all what exists. So there is something like universal evidence of the point of change, sort of empirical certainty concerning the change. And as testimony of all that, we shall read a great poem of the French poet Valéry, Monday. It's very interesting because it's a poem, Marine Cemetery, which is precisely about change, explicitly about change and about also the different philosophical possibilities concerning change. In philosophy, too, the very nature of change is a fundamental question from the very beginning. Maybe it's the first question in some sense. In fact, it's a question with the first great division of the philosophical theory. And the question of change in the history of philosophy is divided in three great sub-questions, if you want. There is an ontological question concerning change. This is a question of being. There is a phenomenological question concerning precisely the evidence of change, the empirical evidence of change. And there is finally the question of the relationship between the two, relationship between ontological question of change and phenomenological question of change. Question of change at the level of being as such, and question of change at the level of our experience. And finally, relationship between the two. The ontological question has been formulated as the most important question at the very beginning of the Greek philosophy. The question is, the form of the question is something like that. Is being as such, being qua being, is submitted to change? No, the ontological question is concerned the fundamental reality of change at the level of being as such, not at the level of phenomenon and so on, the concrete world. But if you have a thinking of what is being as it is being submitted to change finally or not. And the philosophy, in some sense, begins by a negative answer. The negative answer of Parmenides. Very interesting fact. Philosophy begins by a pure negation of evidence. That's fine. It's the heroic decision to affirm that at the end, being as such is not submitted to change. Being as such does not change at all. And not only being as such not change at all, does not change at all, but being as such is completely unified, without any multiplicity. Not change, not multiplicity, and it is why the consequence is being is one, is the affirmation of the one as such, the pure one. No division, no separation, no movement. The one which is the pure affirmation of itself. I quote Parmenides, there is one story left, there is one story left, that it is. And on this road, the road of thinking, on this road, the road of the unique story, it is. On this road, there are very many things that being is incredible and imperishable, whole, unique, unwavering, and complete. Maybe. On this road, that it is. So when we think only the point that being is, on this road there are very many things that being is uncreated, imperishable, whole, unique, unwavering, and complete. This vision is a very strong and remarkable vision. It's a beginning, really. A beginning because it's the affirmation of absolute right of thinking against all empirical evidences. Naturally, Parmenides perfectly knows that our experience is on the exactly the contrary, that all is changing and so on. So there is sort of imperial affirmation of the right of thinking against all empirical evidences. And naturally after that, you shall see that there is critique of against Parmenides. But the beginning of philosophy is in fact this affirmation in some sense. The truth is not a question of empirical evidence. Empirical evidence can be completely false. And we must affirm the pure right of thinking in the field of pure thinking. There is also the idea that if we are in the pure potency of thinking, we are also in the pure existence of being, and not of the things, animals, planets, and so on. Not being as such. And in fact, there is a sentence of Parmenides which is that thinking and being are the same. And it's also a very strong beginning to affirm that not only there is a right of pure thinking against empirical evidence, but with this right, we have an access to pure being as such. And finally, there is a point where pure being and pure thinking are the same. There is something indistinguishable between the two. And on this point, when thinking is absolutely the same thing as pure being, we observe, we are on the road, the correct road, we observe that we are many indications, many things, finally some proofs that being as such is not submitted to change. And it's the profound vision of the one. Finally, the idea is that the thinking, to think is always to think the one. The great one. After that, there is a complete philosophical story of the one. Because one finally becomes God. And the destiny of the philosophical creation of Parmenides. The one becomes the God. In Parmenides, it's not exactly the case, because there is no separation between the one, which in fact is not submitted to change. God also is not submitted to change, in fact. So there is no separation between the one and the world. There is, when we think, when we are on the road of thinking, we are in a unification between all what exists and the thinking itself. So the Parmenides vision is not a theological vision. It's not the vision of a God. It's the vision of being as such, which is not separated of the world. So the one is really the form of being when we are on the correct road of thinking. And we are not on the false road. The false road, finally, is the road of negation. I will not completely develop the question of Parmenides, which is in fact very complex. But the idea is when we are in the conviction that the world changes, it's only because we introduce in our experience something which precisely does not exist, the negation. We are seeing, for example, that this thing is not this thing. But to say something like that, we must introduce in the experience the negativity. But precisely, the negativity does not exist. The negativity is an illusion, is a pure illusion. And so, the false road is the road of negation. In fact, the philosophy of Parmenides is a philosophy of the pure affirmation. We must begin not by negativity, but by absolute affirmation. And if we begin our thinking by absolute affirmation, we are in the element of the one, of the global one. And so we really have the experience of the complete unity of all what exists, without any negation. Without any negation. And there is a great story in all the dependency of Parmenides, this idea that negation is not real. There is no real negation. That negativity does not exist really. We can find something like that in Spinoza, for example. Spinoza affirmed explicitly that there is no negation. But we can find also something like that in Deleuze, in contemporary field. Negation and reflexive negativity, in fact, does not exist. It's not a part of the real potency of life. Potency of life, the big inorganic life, as Deleuze say, is without any negation. And we find something like that in Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the true thinking is the great affirmation, the great Dionysiac affirmation. So there is no negativity. Naturally, all that, in some sense, in the road. The road, Parmenides. The road where our experience is not at all the experience of diversity, multiplicity, and change, but where our experience, fundamental experience, is the experience of the one. So we have first the negative answer of Parmenides. And naturally, we have, just after, the positive, the completely positive answer of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, the affirmation of Heraclitus is to go beyond the choice between being is submitted to change and being is not submitted to change. We must interpret Heraclitus not as a pure opposite to Parmenides. Parmenides says being is not submitted to change. But Heraclitus don't say being is submitted to change. Heraclitus says being is change. It's not exactly the same thing. Being is by itself pure change. I quote Heraclitus, there is nothing permanent except change. There is nothing permanent except change. You know, this idea that being is properly change itself, this idea is a complex one. The consequence for Heraclitus is also that, in some sense, being is pure multiplicity. There is no one. Because if we have something like the one, we have something which is permanent. But precisely, there is nothing permanent except change. So, something exists only by becoming something else. The very being of something is to become something else. We cannot stop the change. So, there is, in some sense, nothing exists except the change of all things. And Heraclitus is the most profound negation of repetition, precisely. Because repetition is repetition of the same. But in Heraclitus, there is no the same. So we cannot understand anything as a repetition of the same, because nothing is the same as itself. All things are different of themselves. Immediately, all things are changed. And finally, being itself is only a name for change. And so, you know, finally, by a strange transformation, there is in Parmenides the fundamental negation, the negation of change. Being is not submitted to change. In fact, that change does not exist. There is no real being of change. So, Parmenides is the pure affirmation, but the pure affirmation contains, in some sense, global negation. And on the other side, Heraclitus is the pure negation, because there is nothing which exists, there is no one, there is no thing, finally, there is only the change. So there is only the constant destruction of all what exists. But in some sense, it's the pure affirmation of change, precisely. So the movement of Parmenides is pure affirmation as, in some sense, pure negation, and the movement of Heraclitus is pure negation, only change, only multiplicity, only that. But it's also the realization of the pure affirmative change, the change as pure potency of being. And you know, it is why we have here the beginning of all dialectics. If we name dialectics, the correlation between negation and affirmation. And it's an extraordinary beginning, this story of Parmenides and Heraclitus. Because in any case, we have in Parmenides the transformation, the immanent transformation of affirmation in negation, and in Heraclitus, the immanent transformation of negation in affirmation. And finally, the beginning is the correlation between the two. That is, the beginning is Parmenides and Heraclitus. Right. And it is the position, the third term in this story, is the position of Aristotle. Aristotle is, as always, neither nor. Ni. Neither. Neither Parmenides nor Heraclitus. First. But Aristotle. Aristotle organized an answer to the question by its division. Its division. There is a part of the world which is not submitted to change. This part of the world which is not submitted to change is a God. There is a God, and I quote Aristotle in Metaphysics. There is something which moves without being moved, being eternal, substance, and actuality. There is something which moves without being moved, being eternal, substance, and actuality. You recognize the one, in fact, the one of Parmenides, something which is eternal, substance, actuality, and which is not moved. So no movement, unity, pure substantiality, and pure actuality. So something which is not in the time, not at all. So the God, the creation of the philosophical God. After all, so after that we have a big history of the philosophical God, but it's the beginning of the philosophical God, Aristotle. Defined as a part of the existent being, which is in some sense the Parmenidean part, without multiplicity, without change, without immanence to time, eternal, substance, actuality, without being. But there is another part of the world which is of Heraclitean nature, which precisely is moved, not eternal, but corruptible, submitted to death, to disparition, submitted to corruption, and which is not pure actuality, but mixture of actuality and potentiality. So, you know, the construction of Aristotle, which has been after that the dominant position for many centuries, is a sort of precise synthesis of Parmenides and Heraclitus concerning the change by an organization of the universe with a part which is not submitted to change and the part which is submitted to change, and the relationship between the two, which is the relation of causality. The God, eternal and not moved, is also God moves the changing part of the world. So the difference with Parmenides, we know, is that the part of being which is not submitted to change is active. It's active. Yes, she is not submitted to change, but the change exists by the action of God. But it's a strange position, finally. How something which is not submitted at all to change can change precisely, can be the cause of all change. So it's the question of something which moves without being moved. In Parmenides, we have not that sort of problem, because for Parmenides, the one is not active at all. The one is sufficient by itself, because there is no thing external. So the Parmenidean totality exists and affirms its existence without any action, external action. The Aristotelian God is moving the world. So it's the causality of the change. There are many questions about this construction, and there is two great questions which are interesting for us today, because they are questions concerning the change. First, is it possible that something which is absolutely in immobility is the cause of a change? It's the position of Aristotle. Because it seems for us that to act is to change, after all. Because to act is to do something. But to do something is not pure immobility. Doing something is a movement, after all. There is the change is not by itself a passive change. A change is also can be an active change. So when God do something, is changing in some sense. And the result of his action is a change. There is an answer of Aristotle. Aristotle says that God moves the world because the world is moving in the direction of what is good for it. So in the direction of what is purely existent. Or naturally, what is purely existent is God. So the world is moved not by a precise action of God, but by an attraction by God. So finally, in Aristotle, God does nothing. God does not work. It's normal. If God does the job of moving, it cannot be purely except of change. It's impossible. Aristotle understands this. And so it's a pure attraction, pure finality. The world is moved in the direction of its proper good, but finally the goodness of the world is represented by God, which is not in the world, but outside the world, and the world is moving because God exists, but not by God, in fact. So when Aristotle says there is something which moves without being moved, we must interpret which moves in a very special sense. It's not a positive action. It's by its perfection. God is perfect, and being perfect, it is a sort of attraction, a global attraction of the different things of the world, because everything in the world are oriented vers its proper good. And the general good is God. So the world goes in the direction of the perfection, that is in the direction finally of God, without any action of God. So, the creation of Aristotle, which Aristotle is always to compose with contradiction. Aristotle takes a contradiction and he says, okay, it's not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. Contradiction between Parmenides and Heraclitus is not a contradiction. It's only that Parmenides knows a part of the problem, and Heraclitus knows perfectly another part of the problem. And me, Aristotle, I know all the problem. It is why I come after. And I know the problem, and it's clear. There is, in fact, Parmenides is correct, there is a part of being, and the perfection of being, the perfect part of being, is certainly not submitted to change, because if something is perfect, there is no reason to change. Okay. There is another part of the world which is not perfect, which is imperfect, which is subject to corruption, and this part of the world which is not perfect is submitted to change. the fact to be submitted to change is a proof of imperfection. That is the difference with Heraclitus, in fact. Understand? Because for Heraclitus, change is perfect. But for Aristotle, no, change is not perfect. But there is an orientation of the change in the direction of its proper perfection, which is represented by God. And so in some sense, we can say that God moves through the world. But the creation of Aristotle is the conception of a new sort of change, a division in the notion of change. Because there is the form of change, which is that the thing goes to its perfection, goes in the direction of its perfection, or of its good. That is the invention of the cause by finality, the cause by the goal. So the cause, which is not before the thing, but in some sense, in direction for the thing. And it is a great question of change for Aristotle. There is mechanical change, if you want. Transitive cause, says Aristotle, which is we have a cause and we have an effect. And so that is the field of physical causality, of mechanical causality. But we cannot explain the world only with that. We must introduce an other form of causality, which is precisely the causality of God in regard to the world, which is the causality by perfection. And with the idea that finally all what exists is in the direction of its perfection. It's the optimist vision of Aristotle. All what exists finally has a proper interest, but its proper interest is good, finally. It's the direction of God. Maybe sometimes we don't understand our interest, and so we do something which is bad, which is not in the direction of God. But generally speaking, we can trust the direction of things included in their perfection. So that is the beginning, the Greek beginning of this conception of change. I recapitulate. First, at the level of ontological question, first the negative answer of Parmenides, which is in fact the pure affirmation of being as such, as the one. The negative answer of the positive answer of Heraclitus, which is finally the affirmation of negation, of the potency of negation, and the compromise of Aristotle, which divides the question along the construction of the universe. After that, we have the phenomenological question. Now, I name the phenomenological question the point of departure, which is the evidence of change. You know, naturally, in Parmenides, we find a complete affirmation of the potency of thinking. But we have also to do something with the evidence of change. And as I was saying at the beginning, the evidence of change is a very strong evidence. An evidence which is present in all culture, all experiences of human beings and so This evidence of change is not a question for Heraclitus and is not a question for Aristotle. Not a problem. Naturally, the evidence of change is not a question for Heraclitus because evidence is true. This evidence is true. All is change. Only change exists. So, for Heraclitus, change is precisely the law of being as such. So, and it's a point, our experience, our concrete experience, for Heraclitus, is in fact an ontological experience. You know, there is no difference between ontology and phenomenology. When we have the experience of change, it's only our experience of truth, because it's true that being is change. And that something of our experience, our vital experience, our real experience, is in some sense an ontological experience, is also the conviction of Nietzsche or Deleuze, that our experience of life, our experience of change, of becoming, is really an ontological experience. It's not something which is separated of being as such. It's an experience of being, finally. We are inside the great becoming of life, and the great becoming of life, we have our experience of change is a part, a small part, maybe, but a part of the great becoming of life, which is finally being as such. So for Heraclitus, not only the phenomenological level is not a problem, but it's a confirmation. It's the strength of the position of Heraclitus. That we must say that our experience, finally, is an experience of being as such. The contrary of Parmenides, which affirms something which is absolutely en contradiction with our experience. For Aristotle, our experience of change is also a correct experience. Because we are not God, and so we are not in the experience of the pure immobility. Our experience is the experience of the concrete world of change. Alors, it's not exactly a purely ontological experience, because it's only an experience of the part of what exists, and not of the totality, because it's not an experience of God. Although it's a very terrible problem in the history of the question. Is it possible to have a complete experience in an Aristotle vision? A complete experience is not only an experience of change, but also an experience of the pure immobility. So an experience of the existence of God. And Aristotle said somewhere, is it possible to live as an immortal? And it was the supreme goal, to live as an immortal. And to live as an immortal is to have an experience of something which is not submitted to change. And you know the descendancy of this vision is the question of the mystic knowledge, mystical knowledge, mystical experience of God. Mystical experience of God is really to be simultaneously Heraclitus and Parmenides. Heraclitus when we are in our imperfect world, with corruption, change, and so on. And Parmenides, when we are in the pure intuition of God, the pure identification with God, which is the content of mystical experience. But the fact that we have an experience of change is not for Aristotle a problem. Aristotle to the point. Because, in fact, our world is submitted to change. For Parmenides, it's a real and difficult problem. Okay, we have the right of thinking, but the difference between the right of thinking and our concrete experience is very big. Why have we that sort of experience of change is change does not exist at all? How we can introduce negation in our experience of life? All that is very difficult problem. Parmenides proposed to say that our experience is purely an illusion. A subjective construction without any ontological value. But what is an illusion? What is the being of an illusion? Problem insists. And so, Parmenides must demonstrate, if it is possible, that our experience is purely and simply false. That is non-existent. And it has been the work of Zeno, the principal disciple of Parmenides. Zeno, which gives to us proofs that something like the movement and something like the multiplicity does not exist. We return to this point when we read the poem of Valéry, because the argument of Zeno is inside the poem. But I think you know that. The point very interesting is that the proof by Zeno that the movement cannot exist is a proof by negativity. It's the proof is a proof that if we admit the movement, we are in a contradiction. So it's an indirect proof, and a proof which finally assumes that negation and contradiction cannot exist. No point. If you have a proof, which is a proof by the negative, that is a proof by indirect proof, if you prove that if you admit that the movement exists, you are in a contradiction. The proof is conclusive only if you affirm that contradiction cannot exist. Because the proof is a proof of a contradiction. Okay, but why not? You have a supplementary principle, sometimes non-explicit at all, which is contradiction does not exist. But in some sense, contradiction does not exist is precisely the goal of the proof. In fact, because movement is contradiction, movement, transformation is also contradiction. So the proof of Zeno is a proof under the condition of the result of the proof. And it's why this proof is so fascinating. The proof by Achilles and the tortoise and so on, written to all that, very fascinating, but it's a pure sample of proof which in fact does not is a proof. because it's a proof, the result of which is precisely to say that we have a contradiction. But the fact that contradiction does not exist is a Parmenidean affirmation, in fact. So the proof is the proof of the fact that the proof is under condition of the result of the proof. And this is a spectacular sophistry. The first rational argument, which is circular, completely circular. And so, probably, it's not possible to have a proof that contradiction does not exist. Because to prove that contradiction does not exist, you must have a proof that really Parmenides is true, that there does not exist negation. But we cannot prove that negation does not exist by using negation. And this point is very subtle and complex. In fact, the general point is when we must prove that something does not exist. You know, there is many proof of the existence of God. But maybe have we a proof that God does not exist? And it's not symmetric. Because if you want proof that God does not exist, it's not a positive proof. It's a proof of negation. A proof that God does not exist. But if God does not exist at all, how can we have a proof that this entity which does not exist? You have necessarily a sophistic use of negation. And it's a point very difficult in philosophy. Because in philosophy, very often, we have the temptation to prove that something does not exist. For example, if you are atheist, it's good to have a proof that God does not exist. But in fact, it's very difficult to find some proof. Exactly like Zeno, when Zeno wants to prove that movement does not exist. But in fact, the use of negation is always very difficult in proof, when the proof is the proof that something does not exist, precisely. Because generally the proof is circular. You suppose that the thing does not exist, to have a proof that the thing does not exist. And it is why the question of change is also in a very difficult relationship to the question of negation. And it's the point of the phenomenological discussion. Because, after all, a change is a negation. We cannot think the change without saying that something is not as before. And so we have a negation inside the idea of change. It is why the idea of Parmenides is to affirm the inexistence of negation. But you see the complexity. If you affirm the inexistence of negation, you are using negation in the form of negation of negation. It's the beginning of the long history of negation, which is dialectical discussion. But we return, naturally, to this central point, relationship between change and negation. I insist on the point that all that was here at the beginning, with Parmenides, Heraclitus, Aristotle. We have, from the very beginning, all the material for the discussion of the question of change. So, for Parmenides, it was a real difficulty, and the true difficulty is the use of negation. If you want refute the evidence of experience, if you want refute the evidence of experience, as does Parmenides, we are in the difficulty of the use of negation. Absolutely. And if you admit negation, in some sense you admit the change. You admit the possibility that something being different of itself, something being the negation of itself, and so on. Just to have an historical idea, the solution of Kant to the question of change is in some sense the same as the solution of Aristotle. You know, very, very simply, the position of Kant is to say our experience is certainly not the experience of true being as such. So it's the negation of the conclusion of Heraclitus. Heraclitus saying, our experience of change is an ontological one. Being as such is change. The point of departure of Kant is the reverse. Our experience is coherent, but it's not, it's a subjective experience. And it's not, there is no reason that our purely subjective experience be the experience of being as such. So our experience of change, the evidence of change, is a subjective evidence. So the problem of Kant is why this experience is subjective and is the same for everybody. This is the problem. If the experience is subjective, there is no reason that the experience will the same world for everybody. The same movement, the day after the night, and so on, it's for everybody. Now, you know, the difficulty for Kant is the difficulty to think that a purely subjective experience is regular in some sense, the same for everybody. And so Kant introduced a structure of the subjectivity itself. A human subject has the same structure of organizing the experience. So, our experience is subjective, but it's also in some sense universal, because the structure of experience is the same for everybody, for every subject. So there is a sort of structural subjectivity, which is the same in every individual. And this structural subjectivity, Kant names transcendental subject. So the transcendental subject is that part of our subjectivity which is the same for every subjectivity. So if I observe that this glass is not the same, but then it's a universal experience, not because the subjects are all indifferently the same, but because there is in every subjectivity the same structure of perception, of experience. But all that is not an experience of being as such, of being qua being. It's a subjective experience, the constitution, subjective constitution of experience. Donc change, our experience of change, for Kant, is subjective and universal. And maybe being as such is not submitted to change. We cannot know. We cannot have any knowledge, pure knowledge of being as such. But in fact, Kant admits that there is a part of being as such which is finally not submitted to change, because he's a religious man. He's a religious man. So God exists, and it's a Aristotelian God, finally. It's a Christian God, but it's a God without submission to change, and which creates the world, and so on. But we cannot know that. It's a question of faith. It's a pure question of faith. So, we are in an Aristotelian vision. There is a part of the world which is submitted to change, which is the subjective experience of the world, and there is a part of what exists which is not submitted to change, but it's a God, and we cannot know really God. We cannot have an experience of God. We must have a pure faith. And so it is why the great question of Kant is a question of limit of reason. The limits of reason. Reason can know only what is presented by experience. But experience is relative to the structure, subjective structure. And so we have no real knowledge of what is. But by faith, by revelation, by conviction, and also in the field of morality, of imperative morality, we have another field of experience, which is not at all a knowledge, which is a faith, which opens our mind to another world, which is a world not submitted to change. You know, that is the Aristotelian conviction. So, I conclude for today. For the very beginning, we have three great philosophical orientations concerning change, which are, with naturally transformation, new details, and so on. But we have three later. We have a Parmenidean orientation, which is in some sense also present in some form of Oriental wisdom. That is, change is illusion, and truth is immobility. Being as such, not submitted to change. Being as such is pure continuation of itself, pure affirmation of itself. And change, multiplicity, and so on are only signs of our weakness. It is the first great orientation. The second orientation is the affirmation of universality of change. Being as such is change. Realize the ontological nature of change. All what exists exists in the form of a becoming. And it's the great orientation, what we can name vitalism. Being as such is like living creature, like something which is alive, which is a potency of life, and constant change, constant creation, constant invention. And the beginning is Heraclitus, but after that we have many possibilities, a contemporary possibility. And the third is the recognition of different levels. A level where change is the law, and a level which is not submitted to change. It's a general framework of the question from the very beginning. And tomorrow, my attempt will be to propose the fourth orientation. Suspense.